Joining us today is Michele Demers, founder and CEO of Boundless Impact Research and Analytics. And today she brings over 25 years of experience as both an entrepreneur and business executive. Michele and her team at Boundless Impact provide objective and actionable analysis that moves investment dollars more quickly towards clean technologies and companies driving positive environmental change. The Boundless method uses a science-based, data-driven approach grounded in proven methodology of lifecycle assessments and serves a growing universe of investors, companies, and funds. She's been involved in the successful development of more than 24 startups and is regularly called upon for innovative thinking about environmental impact measurement. Welcome to the Carbon Accounting and Management Podcast, presented by North Star Carbon Management. I'm your host, Chris Barsman. If you're a professional responsible for managing your organization's carbon footprint, this podcast is for you. We bring you expert insights, emerging technologies, and actionable strategies to excel in the complex world of carbon management. Stay tuned for an enlightening conversation and real-world solutions. Let's jump in. Thanks for joining us today, Michele. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I really appreciate your time with us today. I'm really looking forward to where we're going to talk about. Before we jump into the meat of our conversation, I was hoping we might hear a little bit about you and your background, and then if you've got a little bit of time about Boundless Impact and the work that you folks do, and just kind of your elevator pitch there.
Oh, sure. Thanks very much. So, yeah, I founded Boundless. Oh, gosh, it was about 8 years ago. But the latest iteration of the company, which is that we're an environmental research and analytics firm, we really zeroed in on that about 5 years ago, back in 2018. And we provide objective, actionable impact analytics. And our mission is to move investment dollars more quickly toward clean technologies and companies driving positive environmental change. And we achieve this through a science-based, data-driven approach that is a proprietary method of our own, but it's very much grounded in lifecycle assessment, which is a methodology that I know we're going to chat about today. It's been around for several decades. It's internationally standardized. And we believe that investors need high quality environmental data, and clean tech companies need them too, in order to be able to really differentiate their product and scale reliably and quickly, and just get their funding rounds closed and disrupt these industries. And so we mostly work in energy, transportation, food and ag, advanced materials, circular economy, water, all the different industries that are being, massively disrupted right now because of climate solutions and climate change and the climate crisis.
Wow. You touch a lot of areas of what we're diving into here, so that'll be really interesting to kind of pick on some of these pieces. Some of the feedback we've gotten from our listeners is that they really like to hear about a little bit of the background of the folks that we're speaking to. So as I understand it, you've got a bachelor's from Penn State and poli-sci in government. You've got a master's in international relations from Boston University. You've done some work in the nonprofit sector before. You've done a ton of work as an entrepreneur and in the tech sector. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey of how you, where you started and how you ended up where you are to become the expert that you are today?
Sure. Well, I had a whole career a whole previous career, which has really not a lot to do with Boundless, although it sort of I evolved into. So I worked in international development and human rights. And I had a whole career in philanthropy, nonprofit, and then philanthropy. And I ultimately worked for one of the Silicon Valley billionaires, Pierre and Pam Omidyar, the founder of eBay, and helped them start a foundation. And we were doing impact investing before it was even coined a phrase. And this was back in like 2007, 2008. And basically, that was when I realized that you really, for certain things like the climate crisis, you need entirely new industries to solve problems as big as the existential crisis that is the climate crisis. And I got really passionate about the fact that you really need to build new markets in order to solve problems, and this whole concept of impact investing. And then as I got involved in it, I saw that impact measurement was not being done very well. It was being given short shrift. And you have investors like my former employer, the Omidyars, putting significant amounts of capital at risk to try and seed these new industries. And they ought to get quality research and data from the companies they're investing in. So that's where we started to get more serious around impact measurement. And then we realized in 2018 that there was this methodology called lifecycle assessment that is just very reliable and has been, as I said, internationally standardized and can provide very accurate and relevant environmental and techno-economic performance data on which industries, or which technologies within an industry are really going to be the game changers. And so I just sort of put two and two together and said, we've got to do more of this. And we just built out our own methodology, and we've been doing LCAs across, hundreds of different industries since. And I think the scores and the metrics that my team of environmental engineers works on are very trustworthy and reliable because they are unbiased, and they're validated by external industry and or scientific experts, which is all part of that life cycle assessment approach. And so investors read our reports and find them, really reliable, and companies are using them to essentially accelerate their fundraising and business development efforts. They're acquiring customers faster using our reports, and they're raising their rounds more easily. It also gives them and the investors in their companies very useful data as to how a company can differentiate its product.
Yeah, and I think that's I think for a lot of folks they that are in this field, they're finding that the journey to being in the ESG carbon accounting field isn't as a direct line as I'm a sustainability person and I started there and that's where I'm ending. So I think it's super helpful to see how that journey can kind of wind to end up where you're still doing something that's super impactful and super interesting, and coming at it from a different perspective that's not directly within the field of sustainability. So thanks for sharing your story. Let's jump into it now. Let's talk about life cycle assessments. Let's just start at the very basic level. What's the 101? Can you explain what they are, what their primary purpose is, and how they can be utilized as an environmental impact tool?
Absolutely. So LCA is, just in terms of its definition, is the systematic evaluation of the environmental impact of a product through its entire life cycle. So that means that we consider the inputs and outputs at each stage of the life cycle, including resource use, energy consumption, emissions, and waste generation. And life cycle, as I said, has different system boundaries for different industries. We can sometimes do raw material extraction to production, which is called cradle to gate. But if we include end of life, that's called cradle to grave. And then cradle to cradle is where you're actually using the product back in the system again. So that's circular reuse.
Gotcha. And when you're thinking about setting up boundaries for a life cycle assessment, LCA, what are some of the things that you think about in terms of how do you define those boundaries? What's critical in making the decision around boundaries? And how does that help with the assessment's accuracy?
So it depends on where the product is in its own evolution. So if a product is, if a company's a startup, they're not going to have end of life data, on the product that they can measure reliably, and so you don't usually include that in the assessment. But if you can, it can really be useful. And that's what we call a use case. And so, but it really depends on if the company is at, I'm not sure if you're aware of technology readiness levels. It's terminology that came out of NASA, and a lot of folks use it in the clean tech circles. So companies that are earlier stage might only be like they've gone through research and development and they've got a product prototype, but they don't have a commercial plant built yet. And those are companies anywhere between, TRL level 4 and 6 or so. But then once you build a commercial plant and you're starting to really scale the company, that's further along. And it's at that point when you want to start extending the boundary and looking at the cradle to cradle. And it's not really, accuracy doesn't really come into play as much. It's whatever system boundary you pick, then you need to be accurate for that. So I'm not exactly sure I understand your question on accuracy, but it's really about picking the best units of measure. So we call them environmental key performance indicators at Boundless. And we select different eKPIs for different industries. That's another way that we're essentially standardizing life cycle assessment somewhat. But we get guidance from LCA databases that are internationally standardized. The one we use is called EcoInvent, and it's probably the most ubiquitous LCA database out there.
Gotcha. Yep. Very familiar with that one, and that's a great one to talk about as a resource. So I appreciate you mentioning that one. Obviously this podcast is focused on carbon accounting and carbon management. So can you tell me a little bit about how an organization, why they might do an LCA when they're thinking about it through the prism of carbon management and accounting?
Yeah, so you can't get a carbon credit if you have a product that has outstanding, emissions reduction benefits, and you want to get a carbon credit certification. You can't get it without an LCA. So that's number one. So if you go to one of these, they're called CSSBs, carbon standard setting bodies, and if you go to one of them and you want to apply, you can't get a certification without a life cycle assessment. So that's one thing. You can't also get an environmental product declaration here in the States or over in Europe, which is an official environmental, that your product is environmentally sustainable. You can't get that without an LCA also.
Gotcha. What about for an organization that's maybe not in maybe the clean tech side of things, but they're thinking about the inputs to their processes, and they're trying to understand, this is our main input. We're using some off-the-shelf emission factors. We know our suppliers are maybe doing a little bit better than maybe what we think the off-the-shelf emission factor is, or maybe we think our suppliers are doing worse.
Right.
How would an LCA help with that, them understanding?
Oh, it's so great, because life cycle assessment is, folks are very familiar with scope 1, 2, 3, which is the UN protocol, GHG protocol, set out these three different aspects of sort of levels of emissions. So scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from operations. Scope 2 are indirect emissions from purchased energy, heat, hot water. Scope 3 are where like 85% of emissions of a company is. And those are supply chain emissions, transportation emissions, waste footprint, material sourcing. And it's really like, those are what's being reported on by a lot of your mainstream companies that are not necessarily clean tech companies. But the thing is there are really important differences between LCA and scope 1, 2, 3. LCA meaning product, where you're looking at your full product footprint across, upstream, all the way to downstream, where you're looking at distribution and storage, use, end of life. But you're also looking at material acquisition and like, where did you source the materials and where did you fly them from? And the thing is LCA is a much more reliable way to compare apples to apples within an industry and understand if a company wants to improve its emissions you can use an LCA to understand how does another product, let's say you're, I don't know, you work for one shoe company and you want to compare how your shoe compares to another product, another shoe. If you're a Nike and you're comparing to an Adidas or something like this, you can't do that kind of apples to apples comparison using scope 1, 2, and 3 accounting. That's the only purpose of scope 1, 2, and 3 is just to make sure companies are basically complying with reporting on their emissions. But it's really measuring your operational emissions, not your product emissions, which is what LCA does. So LCA can capture emissions. It can also capture hidden emissions, help a company understand where its emissions footprint needs work. It could be the grid it's using for its manufacturing process. It could be the transportation emissions involved in sourcing materials for its product. But lifecycle assessment can help unearth that, basically. And in unearthing that, it can be extremely helpful in doing what we call, and this is another thing that we offer at Boundless, which is GHG scenario analysis. And that essentially helps us analyze a company's current emissions and then build realistic reduction scenarios and help them build out strategies for having more sustainable products and operations. And life cycle assessment and the models we use for doing it make that a lot easier.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so that's, it sounds to me like, so through the LCAs, if I'm understanding you correctly, that what it can really do is help a company really understand the emissions of their specific product, and then be able to make really informed decisions around how the process for manufacturing that product, so that they can, and then hopefully, ideally they drive those emissions down, can make some marketing claims around them, and then also speak to, if they're a supplier for another organization, speak to why they're able to help that other organization with their carbon footprint as well. So it sounds like there's a lot of opportunities. Are there any other insights that you find that are like economic drivers for folks that are considering an LCA for their products?
Well, yeah. Well, you and I were briefly chatting about this earlier. I think one of the things we do also at Boundless is we do techno-economic analysis alongside life cycle assessment, where we can also look at the cost. If you look at cost analysis alongside life cycle analysis, you can come up with some pretty interesting ways to measure things like carbon, marginal cost of carbon abatement, carbon return on investment, and different ways that basically companies can not only reduce emissions, but companies, if you're investing in ways that companies can really improve their emissions, there's really great ways of looking at. I mean, it's important to include cost analysis and product economics and scalability factors, all of which are part of techno-economic analysis. So we tend to use a blend of life cycle assessment and techno-economic analysis. And it can be really helpful in connecting the dots, basically.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, that, you look at the process, then you look at the costs, and you look at how you can improve and what those costs are to improve, and start making trade-off decisions. Again, I find that ESG sometimes, and this general market sometimes, can get beat up a little bit because they think it's just about the environment. It's only these things. But, I think when you really dig into it, it's about making informed business decisions. And so I want you to just kind of dive into that a little bit, around the idea of, how can a company, that's engaging in an LCA, that they've got trustworthy data? How can they make sure that there's integrity there, and that they're avoiding greenwashing? What are some things that you would recommend, and some best practices around LCAs and all of that to ensure that companies are heading in the right direction?
Sure. Okay. Well, if you're, obviously there's a lot of firms out there doing LCA, and most of them are doing a great job, but there are companies that are attempting to do LCAs by themselves, like self-reporting. And I really warn against that. I think if it's a self-reported LCA, it's going to be greenwashed, because then what they're doing is they're picking the metrics that make them look good, and they're leaving out the ones that don't. And when you have a third party do a life cycle assessment, they're picking the metrics. And then the other piece of and not all LCA firms do this, we do it, is you've got to have an independent expert review the data. So we will hire an independent industry expert to review the data that the company gives us, so that the company can't manipulate its data. And, most companies don't even do it on purpose, but it's really important that you're doing a proper accounting of your own emissions, or your own, it could be other environmental factors, because it could be looking at, I don't know, toxicity, or we could be looking at, air pollution or water footprint or land footprint, depending on the industry. So it's really important to use that independent expert to review the data and make sure that it was properly, all the different factors were properly accounted for. So it is very much an accounting kind of exercise industry.
Do you have any examples of maybe some of the boundaries that you utilized for within a particular product, and kind of give us an example of what those KPIs are?
Sure. So here I'm showing, you can see my screen.
Yep.
A sample of the metrics, we call them EKPIs, environmental key performance indicators, we selected for a biopesticide company, and we were comparing it to traditional industrial pesticides. And you can see the metrics that we selected in this case were soil toxicity, product GHG, which we always do, harmful materials, toxic human toxicity, ecosystem impact, which is where we looked at impact to pollinators like monarch butterflies and bees. And then aquatic toxicity, which is looking at the effect on aquatic wildlife. So this is an example of, how, each industry has a unique set of environmental impact metrics, basically. But by looking at the same metrics for every technology and every company within an industry, it makes it a nice way to do that apples to apples comparison.
Gotcha. And I think you mentioned that you folks do that for when you're doing an LCA for an organization, that you also look at their competitors and help them be able to compare, as it says here, apples to apple comparisons within an industry. Do you have an example of that by any chance? Or?
Yeah, let me show you. Can you see my screen here? This is a green chemical company, and it shows you the different metrics we selected for this industry.
Yep.
And this is, in this case, a green ethyl acetate production, and we compared it. So traditional ethyl acetate, which is in a lot of household products, it's usually made with a traditional fossil fuel feedstock. And this company's using an agricultural feedstock. And so it's obviously a much healthier feedstock. And here you can see that when we looked at the GHG footprint, we compared, and we ended up doing benchmarks on more traditional methods for manufacturing ethyl acetate. So you've got these three other methods that are the light blue bars in the bar chart: esterification, direct addition, dehydrogenation, and then Veritas is the company that we assessed.
Gotcha. And so again, what we're seeing here is you're looking at basically comparing 4 different greenhouse gas footprints between 4 different methods, and helping the organization understand the different methods and where they would land if they chose different ones.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. And then here we looked at other metrics like human toxicity, and then an air pollution metric, particulate matter emissions. And we did the same modeling for the competitors, and we're able to show how the Veritas process had a considerable reduction for both of those. And we're able to kind of mathematically show that. And what my team of engineers does is they go into the literature. We build our own industry benchmarks. So we're not relying on scraping data from existing sources. We're doing our own primary research, and that's why our results are very reliable.
Gotcha. And that speaks to the idea of greenwashing. And
yeah, this is a nice holistic like overview of how we compare this technology to others, and how we end up scoring the company by doing that kind of relative comparison with others in its industry. And those kinds of insights are super helpful for investors. It's very much de-risking this investment for them, which is why companies that use our reports end up raising their rounds more quickly.
Gotcha. So for instance, if we're looking at this chart, maybe we're looking at particulate matter emissions, we can see that they're typical, the conventional method might be higher impact, and then their new version is a much higher or much lower impact. And so therefore, if they're looking for investor dollars, they might be able to speak to this very quickly and say, look at this, you can see that there's a clear impact by making this adjustment. Is that how you would read that chart?
Yep.
Great.
Yep.
I kind of want to dive into the idea of, part of this being scientifically rigorous probably involves the idea of delivering information that maybe the person you're working with, organization working with, maybe some information that they don't want to hear, or maybe they weren't prepared to hear. A lot of the folks that listen to this podcast are consultants, and a lot of times as a consultant, your job is to deliver bad news. So I'm just curious, are there any strategies that you folks use, less about this particular science, but more about the human side of it, of how you go about delivering that information, and what are some strategies that you folks use to make sure that it's heard and that it's actioned, that potentially the company will take action on it?
Well, companies, they want to be able to say they have reduced GHG emissions compared to competitors. But, once in a while, we'll do an assessment and the GHG footprint will not be lower. It will be higher because you're dealing with a company that's just entering the market. It might not have reached kind of efficiencies of scale, right, in its production. And so all of a sudden, the company will be surprised, but they might have a really good environmental footprint because they lower toxicity. If they're a biopesticide or a company like that lowers toxicity or is really good for the environment, but then they're flying different ingredients for their product from around the world. And all of a sudden, when we do the GHG footprint analysis, they've got a pretty energy intensive process. And what we can do then is we can help them model out ways they can reduce their GHG footprint. So it could be reducing their reducing the distance from which they source different parts of their product. It could be using a different grid, like it could be making sure they're using renewable energy in the grid near where their manufacturing process is taking place. Different scenarios that we can basically model out for them so that they can make sure they're looking as good as possible. But we do have times where we tell companies what they don't want to hear. Like they think, oh, we're going to have a home run in terms of our sustainability story because we're a clean tech company, but then they will find the results of the LCA that we've done to be counterintuitive. And, we let the data speak for itself. We're not manipulating the data. And it's sometimes we have disappointed customers because they wanted to see that their sustainability story made their product more differentiated, and they still have some work to do to improve their sustainability footprint.
Yep, that makes sense. And if I'm hearing you right, it sounds like part of it is just letting the data speak for itself, and part of it is, being that partner with them and helping them maybe kind of through that techno-economic analysis, showing them, commercially viable ways that they might be able to make those improvements. So it's about delivering the bad news, but also maybe trying to provide some solutions with it as well. Right,
exactly. And then also making sure that they're using proper, LCA methods, because there are too many companies that are trying to do LCAs themselves rather than, using a proper third party that is trained in life cycle assessment. And there are data integrity issues out there. There are companies that are just grabbing industry data points and then they're saying that's the performance of their product. And it might make filling in an ESG or questionnaire really easy at the time to just grab any old data point. But it's really risky to do that when you have really inaccurate data.
Yeah, and that ends up hurting the whole industry as a whole when reporting is doesn't actually match up to what's actually happening on the ground. So
right.
That's a really, really important point to bring up. Well, Michele, we're kind of reaching the end of our conversation. So what we do is we kind of, at the very end, I like to ask some quick hitting questions. This is just to help educate some of our listeners around some ideas and thoughts that you might have. First one, are there any newsletters, websites, online resources, professional organizations that you'd maybe recommend folks within the industry to consider following or subscribing to or anything like that?
I mean, definitely go to our website, boundlessimpact.net, and stay informed on the latest updates on lifecycle assessment and climate impact measurement. I think companies, like I said, should just really educate themselves on what lifecycle assessment is and how it can be useful to them. I definitely think it's important. It's also important if you're doing business in Europe that you understand that the way you're currently measuring your performance of your product in the United States and the regulations here, they're much looser than they are in Europe. Like if you are over in Europe and you want to do business in Europe, you're going to have to measure not only your GHG emissions, but other things like air pollution and water footprint and toxicity footprint and, the ocean plastics composition of your product and things like that. So certain markets are getting stricter in terms of what they require from products. I would say one other thing I didn't say that I would like to just mention is that the GREET model, which is developed by Argonne National Lab, affiliated with the Department of Energy, has developed this carbon intensity scoring. And carbon intensity scoring is emerging as the way that emissions are being calculated. It started off, it's right now being used by transportation fuels the most, but carbon intensity scoring is now starting to be the kind of the litmus test of whether or not you've done a proper environmental performance assessment of your product, and really helps companies understand the emissions reduction potential of their products. So I would say that is the conventional wisdom in the market now, is following the Argonne National Lab's GREET model to calculate emissions footprint for products.
Gotcha. No, that's super helpful. And I think that's a really good resource and thing to bring up for folks. So thank you. What about have you gone to any good conferences lately? Any good events that you would recommend for folks in the industry to think of and consider?
I mean, I thought the Advanced Bioeconomy Leadership Forum was absolutely fantastic. It's one of the best clean tech conferences out there. And they cover like across the bioeconomy, whether it's sustainable fuels or new hot biotechnologies that are in the energy and materials space, or ag biotech, which is huge right now, biorefineries, feedstocks into biofuels, just sort of a giant field that's evolving. Things like sustainable jet fuels are really hot right now. That was a conference I went to back in October that I thought was extremely content rich and very impressive. I mean, I'm going over to the Slush conference in Helsinki next week, which is the world's biggest clean tech conference. I think it's in Helsinki, Finland, and it's a really big one. So I'm looking forward to that. And that's my first time there, but I'm excited to attend.
Wow, that sounds awesome. That sounds like a fun trip too. What about public data sources? Are there any public data sources that you really like to look at or lean on as obviously you guys produce a lot of your own information, but is there anything publicly available that you think that you'd recommend for people to consider checking out and as they're building their inventories and ESG reports?
So you have to pay for access to EcoInvent. So I'm not sure there are publicly available databases that are going to be super useful. You can use the EPA's WARM model, and you can use the GREET model, which is, as I mentioned, I already mentioned the GREET model. So that's one. And then the EPA's WARM model for calculating waste emissions. It's kind of like you get what you pay for. Where I don't think doing this for free is a good idea. I'm sorry to be difficult, but I think if you try to do everything in a publicly available way, it's not as reliable as if you pay someone to do a third-party assessment.
Makes a ton of sense. Yeah. Next question. If there's one thing that our guests will take away from this conversation, what do you think it would be or should be?
I would like everyone to understand that life cycle assessment and like environmental impact measurement is not a nice to have. It's an urgent need to have. We're moving to a carbon price world where, companies that are not doing honest reporting on their emissions and their environmental performance are going to now have negative balance sheets and stranded assets and a lot of problems. And the companies that are thinking ahead and getting ahead and integrating renewable energy into their supply chains and value in their operations and purchasing and integrating sustainability strategies into or products or ways of doing business into their work. They are the ones that are going to be the stocks to invest in, and I think for investors, it would behoove them to not look at this life cycle assessment and this sort of objective LCA data and things like that as something that's just nice to have, but something they absolutely must have in order to de-risk an investment. And I would just encourage people to be skeptical about the data that's being thrown out there. The data is either being greenwashed way too often, or companies are saying like, hey, we've got really impressive emissions. We've got this many tons per year, or this many kilotons per year, or they're kind of bragging about a number of emissions that is really not very impressive. It's really when you're in the gigatons and megatons of emissions reduction that you're a game-changing technology. If you are doing only tons or kilotons, it's not even worth mentioning because you're not really making a difference. And it's just, that's the one thing I've also noticed is people are just not aware that the kind of scale they need to achieve in order to be a game changer. Because there's an awful lot of folks out there that are doing a little bit, but they're not doing enough. And the investors are really focused on the technologies that have, gigaton and megaton emissions reduction potential. And I think that's great. Like, Breakthrough Energy Ventures is one of them that actually has a target set. And I think there's just a lot of education that investors need to do on, how to measure and understand that and set targets for themselves.
Yeah, that's great. I think those are some really key points to take away. So I appreciate that. Last question. I know we talked about just a couple minutes ago, but where can our listeners go to find out more about you and the work that your organization is doing?
So our website is boundlessimpact.net. And I'm at Demers at boundlessimpact.net. And I'm also findable on LinkedIn. We have a very active LinkedIn page. If you want to follow our LinkedIn page, I'd strongly recommend that. And and send folks our way. We're excited to do more and more LCAs of more and more rockstar products that are emerging. And it's again, our website is boundlessimpact.net. Please follow us.
Awesome. Michele, it's been a very informative conversation today. You've brought to light some new ideas that I don't think not all our listeners have had a chance to hear. So I just really want to thank you again for your time and for your insight and your expertise. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you, and I really just enjoyed the conversation. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate you having me on, and thanks again.
Absolutely.
All right, take care.
This brings us to the end of another lightning episode here at the Carbon Accounting and Management Podcast. We hope you found today's discussion insightful and that you're walking away with new ideas and actionable strategies. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on our latest episode. We also encourage you to join the conversation by rating this episode and sharing your comments and ideas with our community. If you have questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, we encourage you to email us at podcast@northstarcarbon.com. On behalf of myself, your host, Chris Barsman, and the entire North Star Carbon Management team, thank you for investing your time with us today. Until next time.